Well, welcome. Welcome to Interdisciplinary Approaches to Water Heritage. I'm pleased to be with you this afternoon for this series of presentations and conversation that we will have today about water and how water shapes our communities, manipulates our landforms, creates these landscapes that we're all so familiar with here in the Mountain West. My name is Molly Cannon. I'm the director of the Museum of Anthropology at Utah State University. And I'm going to keep my introductions and my comments brief because I really want to jump into our presentations. We will have 4 presentations this afternoon, and then we'll follow that with time for questions. And really, we hope a dialogue between each of us in the last few minutes of the session. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Anna Cohen to join me and prepare for our first presentation, the longue durée of water heritage in the West. And Anna, this will advance the slides. Let's go back and there's your laser. But the laser, okay, that's awkward. Okay.
Great. Thank you, Molly. So thank you everyone for being in this session. Molly and I are going to discuss today the longue durée of water heritage in Utah. And this is really also an opportunity for us to discuss our project, the Water Heritage Anthropological Project, which we have been working on and directing for the last 3 years or so. So this project has a number of different components, draws from a number of different techniques, both methodologically and conceptually. Archaeology, of course, Molly and I are both archaeologists, but also from ethnographic methods, from interviews and oral histories, archival research as well. And public archaeology is a major component of this project. We actually argue that public archaeology should be part of every archaeological project in a recent paper, and also particularly as it pertains to water research, because this is so important to all of us here. Today, however, we're just going to talk about ethnography and archaeology, primarily the ethnographic work, just because this is sort of what has the most momentum right now. All right, so as we all know, water shapes our institutions, creating landscapes and important parts of our water heritage. Water heritage can simply be understood, at least from our perspective, as the relationships between water and communities. And these include and often manifest as historic built environments, cultural traditions, and rituals. If you think of the UNESCO World Heritage definition of cultural heritage, where there's the tangible and intangible aspects, some of which can be sort of quantified, some of which cannot, we understand water heritage in a very similar way. We argue that both archaeological and ethnographic, cultural and anthropological techniques are relevant here because it helps us get at a longue durée, this long duration perspective, looking at the past, particularly environmental histories, from a large scale. And this is in contrast or in addition to smaller scales at the level of a community, household, city, village, etc. Archaeology is, of course, extremely useful for documenting past techniques, what worked and what did not work in the past. Here are some examples from a paper a couple of years ago. Ava Kapjan has a really interesting graphic showing traditional water practices, water management practices in different environmental contexts. However, archaeology can obviously not tell us everything. And so speaking with modern stakeholders, current users, particularly traditional users of water management features, is very useful for understanding this long view. So why are we doing this work? As we all know in this room, we're in a crisis, and there's an image of that Guardian series that I think some of us heard Dr. Smoke talk about. We are in a crisis in Utah. However, I'd be interested maybe later to talk about, is this really a nationwide crisis? Are other people you know in the rest of the country actually talking about this? I know my family in DC is not, but it is a national crisis, of course, right? And so I would argue that we should extend this perspective beyond Utah. So in order to address this crisis, in order to address these issues, we need to talk about how people can change behaviors. There's lots of finger pointing, right? Farmers are using the most agricultural or water for agricultural purposes, et cetera, et cetera. People are watering their lawns, but we need to understand how people can change behaviors. And the first way of doing this is trying to understand how people talk about water. What are the terms that they're using? What are the perspectives? Why is it important to them, both on a family level, but also community, deep past history, et cetera. So in order to do that, we need to talk to people. However, looking at this in the past, understanding how past communities have dealt with issues such as climatic changes, droughts, but also social and political changes. Those, of course, impact how people view water. This is also very important, and this can help us understand successes and failures. I'm not going to get into this too much, but I do, just to sort of set the stage a bit more, talk about water management. So one way of looking at water heritage in the past is looking for evidence of water management. These terms are not quite the same, of course, but they're not mutually exclusive. Water management in archaeology is usually associated with so-called complex societies, village level sedentary societies, and sort of widespread management or control of water on the landscape for consumption and agriculture. I'm still sort of, or we're still sort of working out whether we agree with that understanding of water management, whether it should be sort of a bit broader, because if you look at ethnoarchaeological work, people understand water management in very different ways that are a bit broader than, you know, canals or something like that. However, in archaeology right now, looking for evidence of this is in, of course, the material records. So geoarchaeological research, such as Steve Sims and colleagues' recent work in Pleasant Creek. Also, of course, artifacts, such as this Ute water basket, other rockline canals, such as in the bottom right here. Of course, we're looking at ethnographic reports and historical records and other interviews. Water comes up a lot, right? It might not be the only point of conversation, but it comes up a lot in a lot of these records. One of our graduate students did a lot of work on themes and the impacts on the environment of water in the past. And she sort of highlighted a number of different traditional archaeological areas of study. So settlement patterns, where have people settled? This is very important. You can look at this for a long view in the past, particularly in the Great Basin. Innovation, what worked and what did not work. And then also the social organization and human impacts on waterscapes. And one of my favorite examples is Hiram Dam, close to where we live in Logan, is so low that some of these cars that were dumped there last summer became exposed. And so, you know, Lake Mead and Lake Powell are much more well-known nationally, but this is happening on a much smaller scale, as we all know. So as a couple of examples of some of our archaeological work, we started off in northern Utah with a plan to compare southern Utah. The pandemic obviously delayed some of the southern Utah work until this year, but we started off looking at historic canals in Cache County, in Cache Valley, where we live. And one of our graduate students, Kelly Jimenez, has done a lot of work aggregating the geospatial data on historic canals and water geospatial data sets. And we wrote a recent paper about it. Just one thing that we found, or one thing that we looked at, was eligibility of canals and what has been documented, what segments have been documented or not documented. There's only one water feature or canal water feature that's on the National Register in this area. You can see it. It's kind of hard to see. I can't even see the screen. Well, it's where that star is. There are quite a few, though, that are considered eligible. You can see it's over 60%, but many have not been evaluated. Another thing that we have started doing is we did a pilot project in San Juan County, and these are a couple of images of sites that we visited with input from local archaeologists and residents. Where is there evidence of water management on the landscape, for example? And so on the left, Monarch Cave has a standing spring. And we thought this was very interesting because springs are arguably under-examined in the archaeological record. It's important to cultivate a spring, but do archaeologists recognize this? Not always. And so this is one site that we looked at and that we hopefully will go back and map a little bit more with water as the central focus. On the right too is another site that shows evidence of a checked dam. You can see the alignment of the dam feature there, but there are two drainages on either side that had sort of other rock alignments that were likely checked dam features. So we'd like to go back to this site as well, which is also associated with numerous kivas and a great house and other architectural features. Now I'm going to turn to the ethnographic work. So we contend that conversations with stakeholders are going to be able to pair the past and the present. This is sort of the key between the past and the present and the future. We've done some work in northern Utah, in west of Cache County in Bothwell, as an image here, and then also a little bit in San Juan County, and we hope to expand that. Just to show you what we have done. So the first years we did in that work in the northern part of Utah. Right now, in an ethnographic methods class is doing research in Hiram, so right south of Logan in northern Utah. And I have a little bit of preliminary data from that research. And then hopefully next year we'll get down to the southeast. So with these interviews, we decided to divide our informants into different categories, or to ask different categories of people, because we hypothesized that people would be thinking about water differently. And so we tried to get within our 30 interviews an equal distribution between canal managers and employees, canal board members, farmers, and community members broadly construed. You know, this can be, some of these categories obviously cross-cuts. Everyone was asked the same set of questions in a semi-structured interview status or format, excuse me. And then there are a few different questions for these different categories, farmers and canal managers and community members. We put all of our interviews after being transcribed into MaxQDA, which is a content analysis software, and we developed some themes, or came up with some themes from some of the language that people were using. And so some of our themes include very broad things like politics as they relate to water, economics as they relate to water, conservation, and so on. And so overlapping themes for this particular individual, a farmer, sorry, I can't see anything. This particular individual is concerned about construction. This is, of course, an issue all over Utah on the Wasatch Front, but particularly in Cache Valley. It's exploded right in the last 10 years. And this individual, you can see the words that she's using really speak to these themes of politics, economics, and conservation. This individual, Bob, the community member, is talking about themes of family, religion, and identity. Very important. We heard Dr. Smoke talk about this in his keynote. He's talking about clearing ditches as a ritual, and he's sort of hearkening back to the pioneers and how important this is to his family and how he thinks about it. We heard about this a lot from community members, but also farmers, pretty much everyone. And then we hear the canal board member, Harry, who is talking about politics, economics, and technology, but in very different terms, I would say. He's talking about seepage loss. He has a percentage in there. This interview is actually super fascinating because he has a ton of data that he's just sort of spouting off about seepage loss and water usage and who's using too much, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very different on a general basis. We wanted to explore this more. And so with the ethnographic methods undergraduate class at USU right now, students are in the Hiram area, the Hiram Dam area. They're using the same categories for individuals, the canal managers and the community members and the farmers, but they first engaged in a free list exercise. So this is from cognitive anthropology. It asks someone, what terms do you think of when you first hear the word water in this case? And so people listed all these different terms. This word cloud shows you some of the big terms that people talked about. There's only half, not even half, a third of the interviews are done. So this is from 10, it's a very small sample size. But there are some patterns that are emerging, and these are some of my notes. I just looked at this data the other day. Only water managers are the ones talking about usage. That's interesting. Everyone's talking perhaps about conservation, so maybe there's overlap, but water managers are really concerned with the numbers. You saw in that quote, seepage, things like that. Community members did not identify a water crisis. Again, they're talking about conservation, but they're not looking at this in terms of a water crisis. I don't know if that jives with what you think about when you think about community members generally in water, people outside of a sort of professional community looking at these issues. And so we're sort of exploring, does this mean that there's a disconnect between community members and the farmers and the canal managers? It's possible. It seems like that's what's sort of coming from the data. Perhaps that's obvious, but it's very interesting to look at it at these different scales in different communities. We'll expand and extend on this into San Juan County and see what the differences are in a much less water-rich, at least on the surface, area. How am I doing in terms of time? Oh, okay. Well, I was going to just put forth a couple of very broad themes for discussion, thinking I would be out of time. And so I think I will just leave it until the end, because I suspect a lot of this will come up later on in our conversation. But how does this kind of research impact water heritage, but also water use in Utah and the Western US, and looking at it from a long view? Of course, this relates to management of contemporary water infrastructure. How can we do better? How can we change our behaviors? What is this kind of information going to do to help us change our behaviors and persuade others to do so? Of course, sustainability and ecosystem health. What worked in the past? What did not? How do we see those failures and innovations in the archaeological and historic record? And finally, development and cultural heritage. I suspect Zach and Chris will be talking a little bit about this, but what is gained and what is lost with things like piping and those types of issues across the West. With that, I want to acknowledge all of our project participants, and especially the Bureau of Reclamation for their support, their long-term support of this project. And Zach, we have our website up and going again. I hope you're happy. And thank you all for being here.
Thank you, Anna. And maybe you can jot down some questions to come back to at the end of our presentations for Anna. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Judson Finley. He will be presenting on indigenous water harvesting in the Cub Creek area of Dinosaur National Monument. So this will advance, and
Okay.
that's your laser that will come out the back. It's just opposite of what it should be, so you might
Okay.
want to try it first.
Let's try it first. Okay, so there it is. All right, cool. Thank you, everybody, for having me here today. I'm going to walk you through a very specific archaeological case study of what we think demonstrates an example of an ancient irrigation system here in northern Utah in the Uinta Basin. I'm going to build a little bit on some of the themes that Anna talked about. And really what I want you guys to be thinking about is how indigenous people used their innate knowledge of the landscape to collect water in particular ways that improved the outcomes of their agriculture. Okay, oops, that's the wrong way. Okay, so why does irrigation matter to archaeology? All right, now again, Anna alluded to this a little bit, but for us, in thinking about kind of the long perspectives of the archaeological record, we oftentimes think about the need for complexly organized social systems to develop and manage these irrigation systems. And this builds on an old hypothesis in archaeology, something that's called the hydraulic hypothesis that was developed in the ancient Near East, that essentially proposes that in order for large-scale irrigation systems to be developed, you have to have a complexly organized managerial system to organize the labor, organize the schedule for the water delivery, to maintain it, all of these kinds of things that those of us that irrigate today know is part of the system, right? So I grew up in northern Utah and southern Idaho. For me, knowing somebody called the ditch master made good sense. When I told my wife that we were going to start irrigating and there was this person called the ditch master, she was like, what does that mean, right? Well, the ditch master takes care of all of that on a local level. So so complexly organized societies, but also indicating some degree of subsistence intensification as well, all right? Now, the flip side of that is to think about irrigation as a product of traditional ecological knowledge, where again, people are using their innate knowledge of the landscape to collect water and direct it into the places where they need it to be the most, okay? Now, part of this work for me is informed by a number of different things. In part, just growing up, moving water with both my dad and my grandfather, but also spending time in New Mexico, in northern New Mexico, where these acequia systems have been operating for several hundred years, right? And for me, this is an example of a very locally organized way to maintain irrigation systems. And much like the example that Anna gave, these acequias are organized in tareas. Every year they get together, they clean out the system for the village. They have basically a communal work party that's followed by a dance and a celebration and a feast and all these kinds of things. So this is how I also think about the organization of labor within the context of the types of systems that we're talking about. The work that I do is primarily with the Fremont archaeological record. I've worked mostly in the Uinta Basin in the Dinosaur National Monument area. We think of these Fremont folks as being transitional forager farmers. They made their living by a mix of hunting and gathering, but also agriculture. Lived in pit house villages. You know, this cartoon really captures kind of the essence of all things that we think of as the Fremont archaeological record. Very distinct forms of rock art, pottery, groundstone technologies, and other kinds of things like that. It raises a lot of questions about what are the contexts under which hunter-gatherers adapt and adopt cultivation and incorporate it into their lifeways. And this is really important for us to understand the adoption of agriculture and everything that follows it on a global context as well. So the Fremont archaeological record is really important for a lot of different ways. So this is the area where I've spent most of my time working since 2016. This is the Cub Creek Reach of Dinosaur National Monument. I'm going to step away from the microphone here for just a second. For those of you that have been out into Dinosaur National Monument, the quarry is off here to the west. This is Split Mountain right here where the Green River runs through and then comes out. The Green River Campground is right in here. This is Cub Creek, this nice little drainage that flows up along the base of Split Mountain. And the road kind of follows out in here, and Josie Morris's cabin is right out here in this really nice kind of this well-watered area, not irrigated. This green area right here, I want to point out, is green because of runoff. This is a giant seepage field that basically collects all of the moisture that comes off of Split Mountain as both snowmelt and rainfall, and into this sandy alluvium right here, which would have been an ideal place for people to grow maize in the past. So this archaeological record consists of about 100 different archaeological sites. They're everything from storage sites and granaries to what we refer to as upland roasting features, which are essentially these large charcoal and ash stains with lots of ground stone, where we think that people were taking the green corn and roasting it, drying it, and then preparing it for storage. Lots of rock art sites for those of you that have been down in this area that are visible all along the valley. But the blue dots in here also represent pit house sites. And this is what Cub Creek was known for initially, excavated by David Bretternitz at the University of Colorado in the early 1960s. So my job has really been the Park Service wanted me to come in and study the rock art, I suggested that we had to know the nature of the archaeological record before we could understand the rock art. And it's been a really rewarding process. Okay, now this is going to be the most technical slide that I'm going to show you guys, but it's important for us to understand also how we think about precipitation change through time, right? So one of the things that we've done is developed a 2,000-year annually resolved precipitation reconstruction using tree rings for northern Utah. And what we're looking at here is the variability in tree ring width. And this tells us something about the nature of precipitation variability from year to year and decade to decade. And again, this is really critical for us as we think about water in the past. There's been a lot of attention lately on this mega drought in the last 1,200 years. But what I can say to you is that that mega drought that occurs, right in here, is exceeded by this event that lasted from about AD 500 to 542 right here. That was a 42-year long drought. And we may be approaching that, okay? On the bottom, what this depicts is variability in a temporal domain, all right? So the periodicity of variability. And really what we're thinking about is how predictable is precipitation from year to year and decade to decade. And what this is showing is that, in essence, over the last 2,000 years in northern Utah, precipitation is highly variable. That's what we know, right? You can get a series of really good wet years, and you can get a series of really, really dry years that run together, all right? On average, about every 30 to 60 years, you can expect some kind of a major multi-year dry or wet event that structures the environment. Except for this period right in here, from about AD 750 to 1050, when that variability regime stabilized, right? So precipitation became very predictable all across northern Utah for that 300-year window of time. And what we hypothesize is that allowed those maize agriculturalists in Cub Creek to be really, really successful. They settled down into agricultural villages. So here's what we see in relationship to this, right? Variability in precipitation is the highest, right around AD 250. This is when maize first appears. And then importantly, right in here is when that village was occupied. Now, this gives us the idea, also allowed us to hypothesize that if we thought we were going to see irrigation, we would expect to see it during this period of time when people will settle into these villages and have the corporate organization to create irrigation systems. Now, the other part of this equation is, for me as a geologically trained archaeologist, is thinking about the history of arroyos, these large, deep, steep-sided channels that are common all throughout the Colorado Plateau, right? We know that throughout the region, historically, most of these arroyos formed in the late 1800s and early 1900s, but we know also that there are records of these events occurring in the past as well. If you were an agriculturalist today or in the past, and you're farming on this floodplain, and the stream cuts down into the channel as it does quite quickly over the course of a couple of years, maybe even a couple of decades, that leaves you in trouble, right? Because you're no longer able to get water onto your fields. So what I'm going to show you, what I'm going to lead you through now is how we encountered and have understood and interpreted the stratigraphy of what we think is a water harvesting system. Okay, so I'm just going to show you now. This is what the geological evidence that I'm going to present to you was, let's just say, an inadvertent discovery. We didn't necessarily go looking for this, but we found it along the way. What I was primarily interested in was looking for evidence of past arroyos. And the way that we do that is to use just our basic first principles of geological observation, looking at stratigraphy and horizontal continuities, right? The red arrows are highlighting some charcoal bands that are in the in this profile. Let me point out, this is about 4.5 meters from top to bottom and about 2.5 meters wide. That's a good day of shovel work, right, to expose a wall like that. So we're really looking at the interruptions of these charcoal layers, and what we see is an old arroyo right here that has been filled in. So basically the floodplain fills full of sediments, right? It drops and then it fills back up again. Now, this particular arroyo formed about AD 1400. Okay, so it's about 600 years old. Now, what I want to point out to you is down here at the bottom, see this layer of buff sand that's right in here. And you'll see that it shows up in the wall over here. And here's my shovel, and it's absent right in this area. Okay, so this is what we've interpreted as 3 superimposed irrigation channels. All right. So let me just go ahead and walk you through this evidence. This looks really, really messy, right? First, over here on the far right is this U-shaped channel right here that's filled full of alternating layers of sand and silt, right? That's the first evidence. That gets covered with this gray sand and then this buff sand right here, which then gets cut in by another channel right here, which is in turn filled with graded beds of sand as well. And in that, we see some little, what we refer to as rip-up clasts. These are basically just clods of sand that have ripped off the edge of this right here, filling this channel. That gets covered with these 3 horizontal layers, again, indicating that this was sealed as that channel was filled. And then it's cut down again into our final channel here. The bottom is filled with silts, and each one of these little silt layers, it's a couple millimeters thick, is capped with charcoal, right? So again, really good evidence that fire and water are being combined within the context of this system, all right? Capped again by this sand right in here. And then what we see is that if we track it across the wall, we pick up the exact same stratigraphy over here in this wall over here. So this channel was running from right to left in this image, all right? And again, we see some of the same marker beds indicating that we've got stratigraphic integrity. So 3 superimposed parabolic channels, each one about 90 centimeters wide, about 80 centimeters deep, very nice kind of configuration for what we would recognize as irrigation ditches. The blue dots all indicate where we collected radiocarbon samples for dating. So our other task was to establish the chronology for this event. Okay, so long story short of this chart, the oldest of the 3 channels was constructed right around AD 250, right about the same time that we see the appearance of maize agriculture in Cub Creek. And this is the northernmost extent of maize agriculture in Utah. That was used for a period of about 60 years when it was abandoned for about the same amount of time before the second channel was formed, used for, again, about 60 years, and then abandoned for about the same duration of time. And then we run into a little bit of a dating error right here. But in essence, the whole system operated over the course of a couple of centuries between AD 200 and 600. All right, so what I want you guys to think about is a period of shifting slash and burn agriculture. How did this system operate? Essentially, what people did was they exploited the topography of the natural arroyo system to capture water from these very small scale drainage basins that channel water right down into the arroyo. So it looks like that. Here you see a little bit of a closer aerial photo. The red arrow is pointing right to that site where that ditch was. And all you would have to do to get water onto a field is build a small brush check dam right here and dig a short section of hamlet, right? So pretty easy, straightforward system. At the most, you'd build a ditch up or a weir up here, hand line all the way down. This is about 200 feet of hand line. Wouldn't take you more than a day to a day and a half. This is the maximum extent because what you see above this is all slick rock, right? So what they're doing is trapping water that's coming off of this slick rock environment and pushing it onto their fields. This is a quintessential dryland water harvesting system that is typical all throughout the Colorado Plateau. Now, just as an example, this is right up from Josie Morris's cabin. This is a dam that she had built to collect water for her livestock, and it's doing the exact same thing. Water coming off of this chute of Split Mountain being collected right behind a dam. So what you can imagine is 1,000 years ago, rather than a dam, this would have been a maize field, right? And this is what we call Auction style agriculture. Again, common all throughout the Hopi and Zuni traditions that's been practiced for several thousand years. Okay, so what do we learn? Maize agriculture and irrigation arrived together at Cub Creek right around AD 300. These are irrigated auction fields that are part of what we would refer to as a bundled agricultural niche. So they're using lots of different styles of fields all throughout this valley. We consider irrigation to be part of a traditional landscape management practice that also very likely includes fire to manage vegetation and provide fertilization to fields. Most importantly, that irrigation occurs not during the period of stable, predictable precipitation, but during the period of high variability, right? So this system is designed to collect something that will come in the future. It's built in anticipation. Construction occurred before the formation of the Cub Creek Village, so it did not require the capital cost of food surplus, labor, and leadership, otherwise that corporate organization that we tend to think of as being required for irrigation to appear in the archaeological record. So again, this is a really, I would say, subtle but sophisticated piece of landscape engineering. We should expect evidence of Fremont irrigation. It's just deeply buried. This is 4.5 meters below the surface. It's about 1,400 years old. Sediments are moving through these valleys in a rapid pace. So that's also something really important to know. Okay, with that, acknowledge my colleagues and all of my supporters, and thanks for the time.
Oh my gosh, that was incredible. I have so many questions myself. Okay, thank you, Judson. At this time, I'd like to invite Erin Haycock up. She will be presenting on irrigation usage at the historic Muir-Poulsen House. This will advance, and this is your laser.
Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be presenting a historic case study of irrigation, and with a focus on the methodology that I used to gain insight into water usage at this property. The Muir-Poulsen House. Wow, this is really hard to see. So the Muir-Poulsen House was built by James A. Muir in 1897. And at this time, there was also irrigation in place. We know that because there are older irrigation canals there. And this included a farm, an orchard, and a black locust tree grove. And they occupied the house until the Poulsen family, I really can't see this. The Poulsen family purchased the property in 1943. And at some point afterwards, they started renting out the property, but we're not entirely sure when. We are thinking it's close to 1953. After that, it was abandoned sometime later in the 50s and purchased by Salt Lake County in 1963. We know Salt Lake County started hand irrigating the orchard and some of the black locust trees. So this is an overview of the property. The house is up here, and it's really hard to see these dots, but this is the black locust tree grove. And all down here is a mix of pear and apple trees with some further black locusts down in here. Now these trees were expected to be about 100 years old, thought to be planted with the original construction of the house itself. That was later found not to be the case with these specific trees. That is because black locust was used for construction materials, and those trees were likely cut down. And the grove we're seeing here is seed fall from those original trees. So the irrigation system that you're looking at here is the system that was built in the 1950s. This was built over some of the original canals, but not all of them. And we know, based on information on this sluice gate, that it was built in the 50s, but we're not exactly sure when in the 50s. And so to kind of get an idea of how this irrigation system was used, how often these trees were getting irrigated, I decided to use tree ring analysis, which in this case is going to be very specific, unlike with the previous example. Because these trees were irrigated, it's not going to show precipitation changes throughout time. It's going to show the irrigation changes, because that water changes how those tree rings grow and the thickness, not in regards to the precipitation, since they are receiving regular water. So this will be a very kind of fine-grained example, because it won't match any other property unless they're having the exact same irrigation practices. So these are some of the trees. These are the black locust trees. They're really dense hardwoods. And these are the trees we mostly got samples for our tree ring analysis. Most of the apple trees and pear trees were old enough that we couldn't get samples from them. They were just not stable enough to get samples without killing them, or they were already dead. They are putting out new shoots, but a lot of these have been removed as the property is looking at some remodeling. So as we were sampling, we took 2 core samples from each tree at perpendicular angles to make sure that we captured every ring we possibly could in each sample. These are just, we use standard tree borers, and that's what we're doing here, is we're taking those samples. On the thicker trees, we take them about chest level. On some of the smaller ones, we may take them a little bit lower to the ground just to get an adequate core sample. And then we get into the processing stage, which is the funnest part. Each sample is shaved down and sanded to about 8,000 grit and then polished. You can see yourself in the reflection once they're done being polished. This bottom sample right here is a good sample. You can see this light wood right here is the early wood, which is kind of that early stage of growth in the growing season, followed by the darker stage, which is the late wood. And because this is a hardwood, they do tend to have a little bit more late wood than early wood. This sample right here is not a usable sample. You can't see any of the rings. So if those were present, we toss those out. And then we use this machine up here, which is a microscope hooked up to a Velmax. And that Velmax will measure each tree ring as you go, and it gives you the width and measures back by year. Because the black locust trees were still living when we took the samples, we knew what year the latest ring was going to be from, and so that's how we could date it back to how old they were. And so these are the results of that. After taking it from the Velmax, it pops it into a spreadsheet, and we're able to look at means, averages. And so this top one right here is the mean tree ring width for all of these samples. The oldest sample we have was from about 1920. And we have some variability in here. That's just because of sample size. There weren't many samples from this early tree ring period. But when we get a little bit later, we see a massive decrease in 1943, which is about when the property changed hands. So that's probably why we see a change in irrigation usage and water usage. And then it stabilizes for a little while the Polson family is in occupation. And around 1953, which is when we expect the family to start renting out that property, we see another drop. And so it's likely that the renters were not irrigating the black locust trees, but we do suspect that they were irrigating the orchard. No way to tell it because we don't have any samples from the fruit trees right now. But then again, we see a small increase, and that's about when the county took over and started hand watering some trees. What's interesting though is as trees get older and stabilize, their ring width will increase and kind of stabilize over time. So in this bottom graph, you're kind of seeing that increase in stabilization. And that just happens as the trees get older and stabilize. The interesting part though is these lower minimum ring widths. You can see they increase in years that we expect to see more consistent irrigation. So it'll be here, here, and somewhere in here. This is where obviously the county took over and was getting a little bit more consistent irrigation by hand watering. So even though these mean, these maximum tree ring widths are increasing over time, we can still see the variability in the mean ring widths. And that can still give us insight into how this water is being used on the property. What's interesting about this is we don't have any record or written documentation of how this water was used or how the irrigation system was used on the property. And so a tree ring analysis like this can be used on other historic properties with similar sort of resources to look at water usage where it otherwise isn't documented. Hold on. And in this study was actually found, like I said before, that the trees that were expected to have been contemporaneous with the original construction were not. The oldest tree we found was 1920 instead of 1897. And so by looking at the tree rings as well, we were able to see the actual age of the grove we were looking at to determine that it was seed fall from the original grove, and that there are some possible older trees that were burnt down or cut down that we couldn't get viable samples from. But it also gives us an idea of how this grove was being used outside of water, simply because black locust was used as a construction material. And so to see that the trees were not contemporaneous with the original construction probably shows there's some turnover there. Same thing I just said. And I just like to briefly acknowledge the Utah State Historic Preservation Office who helped me gather my data, specifically Elizabeth Ora, Taylor Rundy, and Whitney Seal, Salt Lake County, and the Dibbleville Preservation Community for allowing us to get the samples from the property. Thank you.
For our final presentation, I'd like to invite Dr. Zachary Nelson and Dr. Christopher Merritt for their presentation as Water as a Historic Infrastructure. And this one advances.
Down to go up. Okay, it's awkwardly close to you. How's that? So I'm going to read this and Chris will do the interpretive dance. So it all works out for both of us this way. You can use the top of the table. Okay, yes, that worked. Water in its liquid state is a disorganized mess. When it freezes, it turns into this crystalline structure, which kind of expands, which is the nature of all bureaucracies. I work for the Bureau of Reclamation. As a disorganized mess, water flows wherever it can. As Ralph Waldo Emerson so aptly noted in his poem entitled Water, the water understands civilization well. It wets my foot, but prettily. It chills my life, but wittily. It is not disconcerted, it is not broken-hearted. Well used, it decketh joy, adorneth, doubleth joy. Ill used, it will destroy in perfect time and measure, with a face of golden pleasure, elegantly destroy. For its destructive power, water is cataclysmic. It washes away what it can and will carve immense channels in its wake, littered with the devastation it leaves behind. The Teton Dam in eastern Idaho was built by the Bureau of Reclamation in 1976. During its first filling, it catastrophically failed and flooded the communities of Wilford, Sugar City, Salem, Hibbard, and Rexburg. Tragically, 11 people died. The dam cost about $100 million to construct, and the government paid out over $300 million in damages. Of course, the danger of channelized water is well known. The Code of Hammurabi, written almost 4,000 years ago, talks about the penalties for wrongful irrigation. If a man open his canal for irrigation and neglect it, and the water carry away an adjacent field, he shall pay for the value of the grain in the adjacent fields. If a man open up the water and the water carry away the improvements of an adjacent field, houses and whatnot, he shall pay out 10 gur of grain per gan. I did not actually look up how much that value is, but 10 for 1. We'll just go with that. Water destroys, but water is life, especially in the arid West where we live. A largely hidden network of dams, pipes, canals, ditches, etc. brings rain from the mountains to the drinking fountain outside of this room. This system is as old as the pioneers. One of the first acts of the Utah pioneers was to divert water from City Creek and irrigate a field for plowing on July 23rd, 1847. Unfortunately, they moved too much water over and the oxen got stalled out, the mud was up to their knees, but that was part of the experiment. Since that moment, irrigation and water control features were essential to what was been called the Utah experiment. However, herding water is a cooperative exercise. Canals do not build themselves, even if they don't necessarily need to be built using complex societies. These were cut through riverbanks with teams of horses and men trying to maintain a shallow contour across miles. And some of the early experiments failed. The bottom was too high for the top, so they dug down more. These were not labors of love, but of desperation. Water is life. The history of water is written across the landscape. Dams, canals, pipelines, ditches are the arteries of life here in Utah. It's a history that is complex, worth saving and living. This poses challenges for those of us in the water business. As an archaeologist, I'm very sensitive to the history embodied in water features. As a minor government bureaucrat working for the Bureau of Dams and Canals, whose mission was and is to reclaim the West, reclaim civilization from a desert, I am very sensitive to the need for water infrastructure to be maintained, to evolve, and to be more efficient. How do we balance these needs? Well, we need a Utah compromise of a different sort. About 5 years ago, Dr. Chris Merritt of the State Historic Preservation Office and I began a process for documenting the history of water infrastructure. As a quick background, the Bureau of Reclamation provides grants for water organizations to modernize their infrastructure. These grants have been responsible for saving millions of gallons of water throughout the West. The Water Smart program helps pipe leaking canals. It pays for meters on gray water systems. It pays for pressurized pipes instead of flood irrigation. It's a very successful program for what it is intended to do: preserve water for human use. However, those savings come at a cost. When a pioneer era open canal is converted into a buried pipeline, for example, no trace of the original canal is left on the surface. Essentially, a bit of history is erased. Memory is removed. If this were a single canal, perhaps it would not be much of a problem. But the Bureau of Reclamation is aiding and abetting the loss of dozens of canals and ditches each year. We're doing a great job at erasing history. In the realm of public law, what was occurring is called an adverse effect to historic properties. As part of the public law process, a mitigation document would be created each time and standard measures would be suggested. But this was a piecemeal effort at a large scale problem. And it wasn't a cooperative effort to build some very real public good for the destruction of history and these historic water infrastructure. It lacked vision, purpose, and focus. Dr. Merritt and I decided on a different course. Rather than continue doing single actions, we decided to work toward a greater goal. The idea was to essentially build a program for water history conservation. Water Smart grants preserved water. We would preserve its history. Dr. Molly Cannon, Dr. Anna Cohen, Carly Smith worked with us to develop the program that Dr. Cannon has mentioned today. The Bureau of Reclamation provides funding to destroy canals, but also provides funding to build a water infrastructure history. This idea was fully supported by my management at the Bureau of Reclamation by having a set process for mitigation. Costs associated with mitigation could be anticipated, built into the budget. The agreement allows Dr. Cannon flexibility to study water history in ways that adapt to changing circumstances. The intent of the law is fulfilled, and the spirit of the law is fulfilled at the same time. Since that time, I've worked with other states to create a broader outlook on water infrastructure mitigation. In Colorado and Wyoming, I negotiated programmatic agreements that would create a single one-stop shop for water histories for those particular states. The idea is that each adverse effect to be mitigated would result in a Wikipedia-like article, similar to a chapter in the book, with aspects of water infrastructure. Eventually, there will be sufficient information on irrigation practices that whomever wants to know about olden times could find it. Architectural drawings, stories, maps, journals. It's a historian's dream in the making. The Code of Hammurabi, written in 1770 BC, details the penalties for letting water run wild. The Bureau of Reclamation and the State Historic Preservation Officer of Utah are leading the West in creating the rewards for knowing the history of water infrastructure. The Bureau of Reclamation learned some very valuable lessons from the Teton Dam catastrophe, including better dam engineering. My hope is that as time goes on, the foresight of this Utah Compromise and the way that it provides information about history will outshine the occasional blemish of a government agency that seeks to hold back the elegant destruction of running water. Thank you.
Thank you, Zach and Chris. Would somebody in the back turn the lights up for us? And I'd like to invite Judson and Anna and Erin to come up as well. Excuse me. Grab another. I've got to pull 2 chairs.
4 chairs.
I'm going to turn this on. I'd like to just invite questions first from the audience, and I have my notes, of course, so I can follow in, but I will walk the microphone to you so that this we are recording and we are also broadcasting to our visitors and participants on Zoom. So is there a question? Somebody want to lead us off? Okay, great, thank you. I'm really good at just sitting in silence waiting for the first question.
I was wondering, is there a website that sort of gathers all of the Bureau of Reclamation and the SHPO's work on Utah sites already? I'm from down around Green River, so I'm wondering, there's a Tusher Dam in that region, if there's anything that's been done there, and anywhere in Emmerich County or Grand Canyon or Grand County that one can look up.
I'm gonna give this one to Zach.
Should I stand up there and talk, or do we?
I'll get get my steps
Okay,
in for the day.
excellent. Maybe I should walk. So the Bureau of Reclamation does put up some mitigation documents currently. It's kind of a haphazard process. So that's why we're funding Anna and Molly to develop this water heritage project, so that there will be places that we can each look for these particular things. So the short answer is not really. Long answers probably in the future. And the State Historic Preservation Officer also has a copy of a lot of our work. As you may know, that in Emery County recently, Joe's Valley Dam and Huntington Reservoir were turned over from the Bureau of Reclamation to Emery County Water Conservancy District, I think is their full name. And so we provided some documentation to them on the histories, but we still retain a whole lot of photographs that at some point would be great to incorporate into these wider projects.
I'm gonna follow up on that. I would like maybe Anna and Chris, well, and anyone on the panel here, access to this, to water research, historic water resources, historic data around water is very scattered, I would say. It's very decentralized. There are some places, I think of Utah State University Special Collections is a kind of a hub where we're starting to see particularly some of the engineering drawings and some of the historic resources come into the archives there. But Anna, I'm going to direct the question to you because I know we've spent time struggling with this. Is there anything you'd want to elaborate on accessibility of water research?
Well, I can speak to the geospatial component. We just, with our graduate student Kelly, worked on a paper talking about these issues. So the water geospatial information is often publicly available, but it's sometimes in a format that's not as readable for someone, even if someone's used to using geographic information systems. There's different code words. It's just in a different format. And so that takes some time. You really need to build in that time in your research process, your investigation, to try to decode some of the terms that people coming from these different disciplines also are using. I mean, engineers might use a different term than an archaeologist or a historian, for example. The historic and archaeological information, you need often a permit to get that. And we were able to as permit holders, but that's something else you need to consider and build in, and for very good reason. A lot of archaeological data is not publicly accessible. I don't know, I think maybe Chris would have more to say on images and things like that. The geospatial is what we've been doing most recently.
Yeah, so that's loud. So the first question was about the Tusher diversion. And, you know, one of the fun things there is in 2014, NRCS, which is another federal agency under the Department of Ag, had an adverse effect to the Tusher diversion on the Green River. And so similar to the process that Zach and I went through, we worked with them to do a historical study. That farmstead now is listed on the National Register, and it was resulting in publication that went into the Utah Historical Quarterly, and then also housed at the museum there in Green River, the John Wesley Powell. So, and when we interact with these one-offs, we try to get that information back to the community of which the adverse effect occurred, because that's usually where these irrigation systems have the greatest significance, is to the local community. Yeah, I'm looking at Craig Fuller over on the other side, who wrote the History of the Central Utah Project. You know, that was a much bigger effort that affected statewide resources. And so there is, you know, all these disparate places that these records get housed. And so the Utah Division of State History has a massive photographic essay that mostly is from non-governmental sources, so local communities and water districts that have produced photos, versus Utah State Archives that gets more of the governmental photos, and then you have the National Archives that gets federal project information. So the work that Utah State's doing, being funded in part by the Bureau of Reclamation, is creating that nexus to where we can track down the spatial, like Dr. Cohen just mentioned, or the historical records, and try to make it cohesive so people in their local community can find out, stuff that maybe doesn't even exist in their local community, like Green River nowadays.
Thank you. Another question. I guess not. Well, maybe I'll hand this to Judson, and I'm going to ask a question of all of you, and you can just sort of pass it down the line. I was inspired by Dr. Smoke's talk during the keynote today. This idea of our work as historians, in his case, our case is a mix of anthropologists and archaeologists and maybe some historians, should provoke and not tear down historic narratives. And I'm just wondering how you reacted to that, how you could think about that within the context of water research. How might you frame questions, and how do you approach your own water heritage research in that light?
Wow.
Well-
Yeah, that's a tough question.
We'll ask one of you later.
Yeah.
Yes,
So
please.
I guess for myself, I think a lot about practice, and, just like some of my favorite things are irrigating in the dead of night and just the sound of running water and nothing else. But also, as I've kind of learned, as I've brought water back to my property, I've thought about two very, very specific parameters, right? Topography, gravity. And when you control topography and gravity, you generate hydraulic head. That's what controls water, right? That's what tames the wild. Put it where you want it. And these are things that, I watched my dad and my grandfather do over and over and over again, right? And so that's part of the narrative. And that's exactly what people were doing in their failed experiments, right? You can see evidence of this stuff. Again, we talk about water collecting, right? The first settlers were doing the exact same thing. They were pulling canals off of all of the dry canyons in Cache Valley, have irrigation ditches coming off them. They're probably not documented, but they're just collecting, they're just using topography and gravity to generate head, put water where they need it. So I don't know. I don't know if that contributes. That's just, I think it just adds maybe depth to think about, the idea that, in my particular case, people, almost 2,000 years ago were using the exact same principles that I use today.
Thank you, Judson. I think that's excellent.
Sort of to follow on that, I'm very interested in this overlap of how people speak and view water, at least in the case of Cache County right now. And, are people really viewing water in the same way? I don't know yet. And can we see that in the past? And so when you're pulling that from the archives, as I said, I think in my presentation, water is not always the central focus of an oral history, but it comes up constantly. What does that say? Does that say that water's central, but it's not sort of recognized, or perhaps it is recognized? And I mean, I'm just wondering how we can, sort of speaking from a community engagement perspective, how we can actually change behaviors and persuade others to change behaviors if we don't get on the same page in terms of how we think about water. Is that possible? I mean, I'm going to be optimistic and say yes, probably. And I think there was a question to Dr. Spoke about, is there another example of a very heavily populated lake where people came together? And I think in the archaeological record, we could find some. I was trying to think, Lake Titicaca in Bolivia, I think is an example, although don't quote me on that, even though it's been recorded. And I think there are other examples, and it would be worth our time to look for those examples.
I think that those would be excellent narratives to continue to share and frame them in that way. I think that's important. Erin.
I don't think I have necessarily anything profound to add to it, but people are always connected to water. And so I think just allowing and engaging the public with their water history and the history of water that affects them is a really good way to just gather information and keep in mind kind of what you're researching if you're researching water usage. I think that's just a really good way to keep you connected to what you're researching in a way that won't become just data. But that's really all I have. So.
Sort of meeting people where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, and I want to give a shout out to Zach for taking the presentation. So I wouldn't have been that articulate. So you're beautiful, man.
Oh.
But to build on what's being said, I've done a lot of tours of Great Salt Lake, interacting with the public and connecting to the stories of the old Salt Air Resort and Black Rock. And the one thing that keeps happening over and over is the very clear disconnection between people and responsibility. And I think Dr. Smoke mentioned that even in his talk, is this is a communal responsibility. But the more that I hammered that point on talks, the more people like, well, it's agriculture's fault, or it's development's fault, or it's that. Why would I change my park strip when all these other issues? And I think, you know, Judson's lessons talking about the deep time perspective of dealing with drought is an important thing to think about. A collapse of a society was based on the change of climate and a change of how we dealt with water, and how we can't just have shift the blame every time. And, you know, when you do more and more research, I'd be curious to see talk about somebody that lives in downtown Salt Lake City versus someone that lives in an agricultural community. The relationship to water is going to be dramatically different. You know, right next to where Erin did her research, there's a siphon and an aqueduct that's pulling water for 73 miles into Salt Lake so people can turn on their tap and drink water. Bureau of Rec and other agencies are managing that water infrastructure, but no one knows that these guys even exist. And I live in a world of laws and agencies, so I know all these things are occurring. And one of the things that struck me at the end of Dr. Smoke's talk is, well, you know, there's not a political will, or there's not a lot of government movement on changing issues. And I disagree. There are, but it's happening behind the scenes. The billions of dollars that have gone through the Bureau of Reclamation into water smart grants, saving salinity, saving water. The Utah Department of Ag is getting $30 million now from the state to move through and do similar projects on canals. It's not sexy, and that's government. And that's what we're trying to do, is reconnect the public and trying to work with academics and the public sector to make people reconnect, because there's a lot of good stuff going on. But if we keep shifting the relationship, well, the feds need to solve it, or the state needs to solve it, or somebody else. How about changing your yard? How about doing the small things that add up over time? And I think history and archaeology has a way to tell those stories in a more direct way than sometimes policy.
We're kind of sitting in the wrong order. It should be like Anna to Zach. Powell was a man of vision. We don't see those kinds of politicians with a stark vision in that way anymore. He came out, he's like, okay, if people are going to live here, we'll need to put a dam here, we'll need to put a dam here, we'll need to put a dam here. And then he rallied people who have never been here, don't live here, to go, yeah, why don't we build a huge, enormous dam on the Colorado River, and we'll name it after the canyon instead of the senator that A.B. Watkins, which Willard Bay, if you happen to know it, Willard Bay State Park, the dam around it, the dike that's like a mile by a mile, is named after the senator who secured the funding for it. A.B. Watkins. Thank you, Arthur. But they were men of vision who pushed that vision to others and inspired them to act. Each of us here can have our own vision, and united we could have a greater vision of helping the Great Salt Lake maintain an elevation. It would require buying water rights. It would require flipping the strip. It would require moving some of the money that I give to other people over to that. But it takes people with enough vision to push it forward and enough enthusiasm to keep it rolling even when obstacles occur. And sometimes the vision and the enthusiasm do not go hand in hand long enough to enact the change. Dr. Smoke was like, I don't want to be a prophet on this, but some of those long-term trends require visionary change to enact.
Thank you. Okay, we have about 15 minutes. So is there a question, another question or something you want to follow up on their comments here?
One thing that the Congress has done is to reclaim such things as fisheries. Congress said to the Central Utah Water Conservancy District and Bureau of Reclamation, if you folks want to save water or develop water, you've got to mitigate what has been done in the past. For example, I have an uncle who loved to fish in the Upper Provo River, Heber Valley. And over the years, it has been destroyed as a fishery. But from pressure from reclamationists and fishermen and so forth, they put pressure on Congress to tell the Bureau of Reclamation and the Central Utah Water Conservancy District, if you guys want more water, you've got to mitigate some things that have been done in the past. And so they went through and reshaped the Provo River. So there are forces behind the scenes in Congress that force preservation and conservation.
Thank you, Craig. Does somebody want to follow up?
I'll let Chris do state law and I'll do federal law. That is very much true. Fish is an unfortunate byproduct of having so much water. No, just teasing. But there are definitely, the Bureau of Reclamation is a federal agency. Congress tells us what to do and we do it. Congress often does not tell us how to do it, and they don't actually fund us to do it frequently, but we do it. There's a lot of behind the scenes talks currently on the Colorado River. Lake Powell is 179 feet below where it should be. It probably is worse than that since he looked up the number. And the Bureau of Reclamation is very concerned about the lack of water there, the lack of water that is going downstream. And we are negotiating with states, tribes, entities, conservationists, river runners, gamut of different possibilities to share the burden of less water equally. What that means, though, is that people in urban settings might actually start talking about water, especially if they're forced to meter. There's proactive metering, which we also pay for through WaterSmart, where communities will get a grant from us and they'll put meters on every step so everybody knows exactly how much water they're using. Unfortunately, with less volume, there may come not proactive, but reactive metering. The city only gets this much. Sorry. So there's a range of possibilities and some of them are more bleak than others. But again, Congress is always a great way to let people know your pleasure or displeasure on these subjects.
Well, and just very quickly from the state's perspective, we're in crisis. The oral histories are starting to use the terms. I think our state legislature is understanding it is a crisis. We're starting to get bipartisan support for solutions, whereas sometimes they're very frustrating because they seem small solutions and we want a big fix. We want a giant pipeline to suck in water from the Pacific Ocean just to save us all. That's not how life works. Small changes are incredibly important. The introduction of secondary metering for irrigation water is going to save billions of gallons of water, not in the small numbers. Being able to direct more funding to irrigation projects to move to piping to save water evaporation, moving from flood irrigation to sprinkler or drip irrigation is going to save millions of gallons of water. And so all of these factors are merely human adaptations to climate and the shifting drought patterns. And we can only adapt so much. But I do think the word crisis has become much more apparent, and now trying to keep people's attention on the crisis is going to be the critical part, because we know in society people have small memories. And even just the idea, I'm looking at Darren Perry, and even the idea of reclaiming as a term, right? Like there wasn't land to reclaim here in the West. It was to make farmland is how we say that. And we need to be thinking about allocation of land use as part of that too. And that doesn't mean just agriculture. It means all of our parks and our golf courses and all of these things need to be analyzed. Density of housing needs to be identified as another way of saving water. We need to be thinking in a generational scale, but making small, minor improvements. And it will never be satisfying, but it is reality. That seemed really a downer. Sorry about that.
Well, I might follow up, and then we can just, again, I'll pose this question to everybody, but how do you see your own research and work intersecting with our understanding or our ability to contextualize this water crisis? Where's your impact? And we could start with Zach and hand it back down.
All right.
To Judson.
So as the federal official here, I'm not in charge of allocating money, but what I am in charge of is helping make sure that when we do allocate money, that we get the voices heard, we do reach consensus, we talk with the communities. So for example, the Bear River Massacre Interpretive Center is a great, wonderful project that the Northwest Band of Shoshone is doing. Reclamation's helping fund vegetation removal of non-native tamarisk and Russian olives that actually eat a whole lot of water. And they're going to replace those with willows and traditional plants that would have been there. So in that sense, it's a very wonderful project because we are building in a place that should never have been touched. On the other hand, I'm also helping with piping these permeable canals so that the water actually goes to the human use destination. I won't say anything about aquifers, so that it can be served for the communities. So there are things on the federal level to preserve water and continue to move them around, and occasionally a happy project about helping communities in their quest for replanting, renewing the land.
Zach?
And real quick, our office's job is to work with our state and federal partners, and the project that Zach mentioned that Utah State has taken the charge on was just a way to expedite these changes, to not continue to drag these piping projects on through long-term negotiations and maintenance, but to allow the money to go very quickly to the producers to make these changes quickly. And so I approach it like I have a small piece of the water pie, but I'm trying to use my office's role to find ways to efficiently get these programs on the ground to save water that way, but also find creative archaeological or historical stories to help convey that to the public, that we all have a stake in this. And if, again, we cannot shift responsibility, we all have a stake in water for the future. And I have my office's role, and we do our best to try to make those points of working with our agency partners, but making it also very aware to the public through public talks, awareness, public mitigation, to try to do all that we can to raise the awareness.
I'm very new across the board. So I think for me, being engaged with the conversations that are happening and bringing my own perspective to them, as well as allowing for space to learn and take in not only what I'm doing archaeologically with research, but what is happening currently, and thinking about how they intersect and the relationships between people and the way water is used will be a good way for me to move forward personally. Just as I said, I'm very new, so I don't have a backlog of things to think about. It's moving forward that's important. So.
Molly, you have to answer this question too. So I think I've already said quite a few things in relation to this, addressing this question, but I hope that the work we're doing is pairing past and present and showing how that can be done in multiple ways. As an archaeologist by training, I sort of trend, or I have trended towards scientific hypothesis-driven research, and that's sort of my wheelhouse. But equally important, of course, is speaking with people, engaging the archival work, and looking at policy and things like that. And one thing I'm just going to throw out there is that I was reading through a land management plan put forth by the Intertribal Coalition for Bears Ears, and one of the suggestions was to include ethnography and oral histories in all compliance work. And that's something that I've really seen. I've seen the positive impact of that for this project, and maybe that's something that more archaeologists can think about.
I've gotten myself in trouble recently by wondering sometimes what the relevance of the deep time archaeological work is. And I struggle with it. I'll be totally frank with you, right? But really, we think a lot, and the folks that I work with, there's a couple of these are buzzwords, right? But they're important, right? Because we talk a lot about resilience and vulnerability, but we have to understand time and variability through time to really wrap our heads around that, right? So one of the concepts that we've talked about is what we refer to as safe operating spaces, right? And which is, creating this domain that we can maintain a particular level of our society, whether that's population, economy, other kinds of things like that. And what do we do as human societies to push ourselves closer to the edge of uncertainty, right? And where do we define that? How do we define that? And I think we've come awful close, right? But again, in order to understand that, we have to know, for example, what constitutes variability in precipitation for the last 2,000 years, right? Because so many mistakes were made in thinking, for example, building water management plans in the 1950s when it's the wettest decades of the last 300 years, right? Well, hindsight's 2020. So the other thing that, that I really think a lot about is also what's referred to as climate smart agricultural systems, right? And so these are ways, that the systems that we look at in the past, these indigenous systems, were very, very smart, because that variability regime that's causing us troubles now was not a problem for folks in the past, because they knew how to cope with that. They used diversity in their landscape to buffer out the variability, because they knew that that was part of the equation. So I think we have to embrace that. We have to embrace that we're going to have good times, we're going to have bad times. And we have to have systems that are designed to compensate. But we've taken ourselves maybe even beyond our safe operating space. So I think that might be the lesson that I would suggest the archaeological record offers.
Thank you. Yes.
Talking more to the higher education piece, for it to be sustainable, do you have enough recruits, students who are interested in this field? And what are your recruiting practices? Do you collaborate with other universities to see if these goals don't die away, including statisticians? Do you use that too? Do you have a program for that to evaluate all of your work?
What an excellent question. I'm going to have Anna and Judson answer this question. And then, but please.
Give this to you.
Oh, thanks.
New faculty member.
So no, we don't have trouble recruiting students. I mean, we listed the students up there. I would say in the last 3 years, we've had 7 students, graduate and undergraduate. And this ethnographic methods class by another colleague of ours at USU eagerly went down to Hiram. They're there right now, are interviewing people and learning ethnographic methods, and they're going to present it at a conference next year. So I don't think it's difficult, at least up at USU. I can't speak to other universities. We do want to collaborate and work with other people. We've made some of the connections with museums and community members down in the Blanding area, and are still working in Cache Valley, Cache County as well. And we'll be expanding. I mean, I just spoke about a tiny bit of the project. There's many more people involved, and evaluating the work, though, that's interesting. We haven't done that. I don't know what that would look like, but that is something interesting to think about, how to evaluate the impact of the work. I mean, this isn't like applied medical anthropology or something where you can say how many people are having access to X medicine and clean water and things like that, but that is something we should think about. Zach, if you have any ideas, you can let us know.
So I'm let's just say relatively new in the land of university administration. So I'm a department head for sociology and anthropology, and there's a lot of interesting conversations and that I'm having with my colleagues. And one of the things that I talked about, I met with some of my colleagues last week to talk about some possibilities: a sociologist, a forester, a geologist, and an archaeologist, right? And we're all interdisciplinary thinkers. And what I suggested is that what we've seen is that things like NEPA, the National Environmental Policy Act, and the structure of agencies was designed to be interdisciplinary, but it failed because it created silos in which people didn't really communicate with each other. And that got perpetuated down into the academy and how people were trained. And there was a real breakdown. And the breakdown also comes in what I would suggest is collaboration and consultation with Indigenous communities. Now that there's this kind of sea change, and a lot of those older scholars are retiring, and those of us who are brought up in a more interdisciplinary context are coming into roles of leadership, we're starting to think more about who are we training for the future, and what are we training them for? And I learned from my own students, right? And because they're thinking about these issues, and one of those issues is climate adaptation, right? What are we gonna do moving forward? And what we're seeing is that the need and the demand for trained foresters and other things like that is exceeding the supply, because we haven't shifted what we're thinking about training for, right? You have to change in order to adapt to landscape management for a forester. You have to shift away from a model where we're training people about how to harvest wood to how to plant trees, right? That also requires close collaboration with lots of different disciplines and Indigenous communities to bring that traditional knowledge back into a management strategy. And so I think that we're going to see over the next couple of years, I'm hoping, and I'm very optimistic that we'll see some really cool interdisciplinary and highly collaborative projects develop out of Utah State University. And what Molly and Anna and Zach and Chris are doing, I think, is a really excellent example of how that starts.
Thank you. We are at time, but maybe the final word, Zach.
Okay. I was just going to say that, as from my experience, when the Bureau of Reclamation hires new engineers and they've taken a course in NEPA or taken a course in preservation at the university, they will talk more with the environmental group in the earlier stages of projects that we can incorporate our needs into projects. So the education of any individual is a worthwhile goal. There we go, something profound.
That's great. Thank you. And thank you everyone for attending.